This is PowerPoint Lecture 1.6 on political developments of the late 19th century. We'll open up with just the general trend politically, which I've already mentioned before, primarily what you have from really the end of the Civil War, and we touched on it in Reconstruction, until really the rise of Theodore Roosevelt at the turn of the century, 20th century, is you have the dominance of Congress. And so you see there in the middle of the PowerPoint slide the 5 weak presidents, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Harrison, and Cleveland. These are the presidents during this period of time. And it's the reason that you really can't remember, and you're not to be faulted for that. Nobody can. I have trouble remembering the presidents of the late 19th century. And this is because they really were do-nothings. They pretty much, for the most part, deferred to Congress on all decisions. You also have the rise of the party machines. Now, what the party machine did, this is the famous era of Boss Tweed in New York, and we'll get to that in a later slide, but essentially they mobilized political resources in favor of a candidate, and they would do this in exchange for favors from the candidate. So the party machine represented and facilitated the degeneration of American politics in the late 19th century into corruption. And we'll deal with this as well kind of throughout, but I'll just make mention of it now. Alexis de Tocqueville writes a thing called Democracy in America, and this is the time that starts to take place. We begin to have American politics dominated by a professional class of politicians. The founders, when they organized the system, they didn't really envision a class of professional politicians. That's what dominates the United States now, is this professional class of politicians, most of whom are lawyers. Now, at the end of the century, for reasons that we've talked about, okay, primarily economic in nature, the Populist Party is going to rise up. There are a number, and we'll go over them, there are a number of small splinter parties that begin to rise up towards the last quarter of the century, 1875, 1870 onwards. These will ultimately be coalesced, to use the term. They'll coalesce into the Populist Party, and we'll deal with them more specifically when we get there. And partially as a result of the rise of this progressive movement, which is represented by the Populist Party, we'll have a rising tide at the end of the century of government intervention, particularly government intervention in the marketplace. Now, this is something that there I go with the nows again. I gotta stop that. Stop me before I now again. It's funny. Okay. Southern politics post-Civil War. We talked about this a little bit before. This is the stuff that we covered a little bit in Reconstruction. The Democratic Party suffered seriously. What you'll have after the Civil War is you'll have about 10 years where the Republican Party just dominates everything. It's a dictatorship of the Republicans, which at least partially explains a couple of things. It'll partially explain the rise of the corporation and the corporate structure and the rapid growth of industry, which the Republicans favored. It will also explain partially why there was such difficulty in forming organized labor movements, because the Republican Party opposed organized labor movements. Particularly the Republicans will dominate the Senate, and that's actually something that's going to go on until only recently. And actually in the last election, in the 2014 election, the Republicans took back the Senate. Traditionally, the Republicans have dominated the Senate because traditionally the Senate, the U.S. Senate, represents the wealthy class. Although really, if you look at it demographically, there's nobody missing any meals in the House of Representatives. None of those people ever had to, beg for their bread, so to speak. Now, the basis of the party, where geographically, where they and I guess socially, where their support came from, you see the Republicans were in the North, which is traditional. Now, I mean, we want to tie this back. The Republican Party starts in the 1850s, okay? Prior to that, and we're not going to go through the entire history of U.S. politics, but if you'll recall from U.S. History 1, the party that favored a strong national government was the Federalist Party, represented best by Alexander Hamilton. Okay? Well, the Federalist Party's base of support was in the Northeast, was in the New England states. Well, that's going to become the basis of the Republican Party as well. They'll also dominate in the Midwest. Why is this? Well, because the Midwest is the Great Lakes region, and the Great Lakes region becomes the base of industrial growth. And as I've said, the industrialists support the Republicans and vice versa. So it's not surprising to us that they would rise in the North and the Midwest because that's where manufacturing becomes located. You also have, in addition, the older Americans, okay, not the immigrants. The immigrants that were coming in first, beginning with the 1840s and the Irish immigration, and then through the 1860s and 70s and all the way through the turn of the century, the immigrants generally will favor the Democratic Party. The old natives will favor the Republican Party. And that was in Gangs of New York, that was Daniel Day-Lewis. He was the old natives, and Leonardo DiCaprio, who was ultimately the head of the Dead Rabbits gang, represented the immigrants. Also, Protestants will favor the Republican Party, and Protestants happen to be the dominant religion at this time. Creditors, meaning bankers, people who hold debt, freed slaves, blacks, and the entrepreneurs, as I've said before. The Democrats will dominate in the South. Immigrants, Catholics, debtors, workers. Okay, the exact opposite of the Republican Party. And we don't want to get confused here. I don't want you to get confused in this. The Republican Party as it exists today is not the same as the Republican Party as it existed in the late 19th century. A lot has changed, and we'll deal with that more specifically in Epoch 3 when we deal with political developments more recently. It's a relatively recent phenomenon that both parties represent large levels of government intervention and large levels of government stimulation of the economy, etc., etc. Used to be the Republicans were laissez-faire. They didn't believe in government intervention at all. And the Democrats become the laissez-faire, or become the interventionists. But the Democrats don't become the interventionists really until the 1930s with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that's largely because over about a 20-year period, the two parties vie for the populist party's support line. Okay, in other words, we'll deal with this in just a second. The Populist Party develops a party platform, and the Republicans and Democrats will pull planks from that platform, adding them to their own position, to their own platform, in an attempt to co-opt the Populist Party. This is why the Populist Party doesn't last long. The Populist Party only lasts about 10 years before it's co-opted into the other two. First, it's co-opted into the Republicans. This is going to be represented by Theodore Roosevelt, who will later kind of represent a third party in the Bull Moose Party. We'll deal with that in Epoch 2. And then ultimately the progressives will be co-opted by the Democratic Party with Woodrow Wilson. And then again with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the Republicans will see a resurgence in the 1920s. And okay, well, again, all that will be dealt with in Epoch 2 at more length. And here we have this what I suggested at the outset of this, which is the rise of the third parties, the Populist Party being the most significant of them. And as I said, most of the other splinter parties, the Prohibitionists, the Greenback, the Union Labor Party, the Anti-Monopoly Party, will all get consumed. They'll all forge together to form the Populist Party, which will become a more viable third party. The problem is that in American history, there really has been very few viable third parties. This makes the United States stand kind of alone among political systems, particularly open political systems. And it's something that in comparative political systems, when I used to teach comparative political systems, we used to talk about this at great length, the relative openness of a political system. Well, as it works out, the United States is not a particularly open political system because divergent viewpoints are generally the splinter parties, and because of the single-member district system of the United States, they generally aren't represented, okay? And what I mean by this is that there are a vast number of Americans who feel themselves either unrepresented or underrepresented because when they go to the polls, rather than voting their opinion or voting their ideology, they have to choose between a Republican and a Democrat, and which of them most approximates their ideology. Well, when you have viable alternative parties, you don't have to do that. You have actual candidates that represent your ideological point of view. But in a single member district system, and just very quickly without this becoming a lesson in political science, a single member district system is a system where the geographic regions of an area are divided, and each geographic region has one representative for a constituency. This is different than a multi-member district system where when you geographically divide the constituency, you then assign them a certain number of votes proportional to their population. Then based on the proportion of the vote, or the percentage of the vote that each party receives, they get a certain number of seats. So for example, an individual district could have as many as 10 seats. Okay? And so a party that goes to the poll and wins 10% of the votes would get one of those 10 seats. This gives greater credence to, or greater voice to the divergent viewpoints. And the last point that I make here on this PowerPoint, this is going to become, there's going to be a backlash against this with the populists in the 1920s, that the Populist Party and the progressive movement itself has a certain socialist overtone to it. And this is going to come back to haunt them because, without getting into the background at this point really deeply, we'll hold it off for Epoch 2. The Bolsheviks take over in Russia in 1917, and it's the time of the first Red Scare in the United States, because with the rise of populism and the progressive movement, there's a concern that such a revolution could possibly take place in the United States. And this is one of the reasons that the Republicans will come to dominate in the 1920s. Most of these splinter parties, as I call them, most of these divergent viewpoints, which will ultimately coalesce in the Populist Party, are what would be called single-issue parties. I've talked to my wife about this. My wife is a recent citizen of these United States. My wife's from London originally. She's lived in the United States since '81, but she just recently got her citizenship in 2011. And we've gone out to vote, and it's absolutely, I got to tell you, it's the most fun to go voting with my wife, because literally it takes us forever. We go in there, and they always have a ballot sitting there with all the candidates. It takes us, before we go and register our names that we're there, it takes us a good 20 minutes, because we sit there and we Google every individual candidate. And I've discussed it with my wife, the idea of a single issue voter. There are a lot of voters who go out and vote based on one and only one issue, rather than looking at the constellation of issues that a candidate or set of candidates represent. This is going to become the real beginning of that in this single issue. A lot of people will vote single issues. You see, for example, the Grangers, they favor anything that favors the farmers. Okay, well, they'll have an antecedent with the Greenbacks, because the Greenback guys, they favor a greater amount of paper currency, which means more money in the system, which means more money for lending, which helps the farmers. Okay, they'll also the Grangers will also favor lowering trade barriers, etc. The American Iron and Steel Association represents the industrialists. The American Protective Tariff League represents the industrialists. Mugwumps are more similar to the Grangers. They're anti-tariff. They're anti-Grange because they don't like the farm. Essentially, they don't like the emphasis on the agricultural sector. They're in favor of manufacturing, but for the most part, they're laissez-faire economics. They'll go away very quickly. Civil Service Reform League, etc. You see the rest of them. These women's groups, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, headed by Susan B. Anthony, which ultimately will gain the women the right to vote in 1920, but that'll be long after the American Women's Suffrage Association is done away with. And these single issue parties, the way to understand them, you see there at the bottom of the PowerPoint, the way to understand them is less as a political party and more as the forerunners to lobbying groups. See, this is before the heyday of lobbying groups and before the domination of lobbying groups in Congress. These are going to be the beginnings of lobbying groups. Okay? And so their platforms, they really don't have platforms. The Grangers have probably the most extensive platform. They don't really have platforms. They have planks. A political party, you've heard this term before, I'm sure, a platform. Well, the reason they say this is a platform is a set of issues on which you stand, like a platform, okay? Like a deck. Think of a deck to a house. Well, that deck to a house is comprised of individual boards. Well, those individual boards are called planks. And so a party's platform is made up of several different planks. For the most part, these guys don't have platforms. They only have planks. And then they advocate those planks. And then based on their influence, those planks will be adopted either by the Republican or the Democratic Party, or in the case of the late 19th century, all these planks will come together to form the basis of the platform of the Populist Party. Okay? I know that's a little hard to understand. Okay? But these are single issue people. When you add all these single issues together, you're going to wind up with a platform. And that platform will become what's known as the Omaha platform, which would be the platform espoused by the progressive movement or the populist. Now, the basic platforms of the two main parties, the Republicans, really the holdover of the old Federalist Party. They favor a strong central government. They are nationalists, limited government intervention in the marketplace, which means laissez-faire, and conservative social policies. Okay? And to some degree, anyways, the Republican Party today, at least the Tea Party part of the Republican Party, that further conservative element of the Republican Party represents this. Now, the Democrats at this time favor limited national government. Okay, they believe in individual liberty. This is one of those things I've told you before. There have been certain things that bump up and they'll bump up again. They just go through me like a rusty steel nail. One of them is the reference to someone as a liberal. Liberal is a classical political term. What liberal means is that you are in favor of individual liberty. At this time period, that was represented by the Democratic Party. Okay, they believed in individual liberty. Nowadays, neither the Democratic or the Republican Party believe in individual liberty. How do I know this? Because they shoved flood insurance up my butt. That's why I know this. Wouldn't have had that happen back then. But government intervention is everything. They want to tell us how to run our lives. They want to tell us who can and cannot get married. They want to tell us who can and cannot do this. That's not a liberal. Okay? A liberal is of the mind that the national government of the United States does not have the authority to express a viewpoint on a given issue. Okay? So, for example, if you take, for example, the hotly contested abortion issue, the classical liberal viewpoint on that is represented by the Libertarian Party. It's neither the government's in favor of it or opposed to it. It's that the government does not have the authority to voice an opinion on the issue. Okay? The individual liberty people are more in favor of a strict interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. That if it doesn't explicitly give the national government the right to do something, then that right is either reserved to the states or to the individual. Despite this, and this is going to be the death knell, they favor government intervention in the marketplace and regulation of business. Okay? There's a contradiction. If you favor individual liberty, then you don't favor government regulation of business. Okay? Because business is itself an individual. This will ultimately be represented by what we talked about in, I think, 1.2, which was the development of a limited liability corporation. Here we see what I talked about before. This is their stronghold. We talked about the party machines, and I mentioned that I'd talk about it later. Now it's later, and now I'm going to talk about it again. Boss Tweed, the most famous of them in New York. Richard Crocker from New York, also the Democrat. He was Boss Tweed's arch rival, nemesis. George Cox of Cincinnati. And the idea was that the party machine would bring to bear its apparatus, okay, in the media, financially, it would get voters out to the polls, and it would instruct them how to vote for the party. In exchange, the heads of the party machine would receive favors from the candidates and parties that they backed. They would then distribute those favors to the constituency of the party machine as they saw fit, as a reward basis. Okay, so it was, and so as a result of this greatly accelerated the kind of spread of corruption throughout the end of the 19th century, really beginning with U.S. Grant, with Ulysses S. Grant. From that point up until Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is going to be the first one to systematically address corruption in the government and start to deal with it. They'll work with it a little bit earlier than that with the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which I'll get to in a minute. And as a result of this, they were very successful in coalescing voters behind an issue. Okay, so you had much higher voter turnouts back then, and that the reason was the party machines. Now the party machines are not very powerful. Okay, back in the day, in the late 19th century, you see in the 1870s and 80s, you had 80% voter turnout. Well, this is because of the party machine. The party machine would actually go door to door and get people out of their houses to go and vote. That doesn't happen as much anymore. As I've said before, the balance of power, this is the legacy of Reconstruction. With the attempt to impeach Johnson, we see the first real expression of congressional domination of the presidency. That's going to run throughout the period. And as I've said before, we have the Republican Party, which pretty much dominates. There are a few times that we have a Democratic Congress during this period. Most notably, when there's economic downturns, we take a look at this. We see here. You see, if you take a look, let me get my laser pointer up and running. If you take a look at this, if you recall, there was a depression in 1873. Okay, by 1875, the Democrats will take advantage of this and win the House of Representatives. This will last all the way through 1881. Okay, but by then the country's back on its feet a little bit. Business is booming. The spread westward is taking place. The Republicans will recapture the House. Okay, and I put this in. This is the source of this is from the U.S. House of Representatives. If you go to the U.S. House of Representatives website, they have all this data going back to the beginning. Then again, you see in the mid-'80s, the Democrats will take back over and pretty much dominate through the remainder of the period. This one little brief point in the 51st Congress from 89 to 91, the Republicans will take it back barely, but then the Democrats will tend to dominate. But if you notice the Senate for the most part is going to be dominated by the Republicans, and that'll go through into the 20th century. Enough said of that. Kind of an interesting tidbit. I'm one of those. I'm political science. As I said, I'm a political economist. My training is in political science and economics. In political science, people break into two general categories. There are the political studies people who are I don't know. Well, I shouldn't say that. They're BS artists. Okay, and then there are what we call the number crunchers. I'm one of the number crunchers. Okay. Okay. The weak presidencies we see here, we have Grant, Hayes, Garfield. Garfield was killed in office in 81. Chester A. Arthur, bet you never heard of him. No, that's not true. That's a gratuitous shot at Chet Arthur. Good. Yeah, no, it wasn't a gratuitous shot. He was a nobody. Benjamin Harrison. Now, Grover Cleveland is the only president in American history to serve split terms. You see, he wins the 84 election, then loses the 88 election, and then wins again in 92, partially because the economy is going into the dumper at that point. You have the Panic of 1892, which will spread into the Depression in 1893, and so there will be a reaction against the Republican Party, and Cleveland will ride that back into office. He's the only president in history to have a split term like this. And remember that at this point in history, there's no limitation to presidential terms to being limited to two presidencies, to being a two-term limit. That won't be imposed until after Franklin Delano Roosevelt. First one to be subject to that would be Harry S. Truman. Okay, who as a result of that can't run in the 1952 election against Eisenhower. And you see what we've talked about before, the caliber of president. Now, here we enter into the discussion of progressivism. It is a reaction to the economic and political conditions of the time, which you see there. It's the strain on the banking system, the progressively worse conditions for the agricultural sector, for the reasons that we talked about in previous PowerPoints, okay, particularly with agricultural developments, but also in the discussion of industrial development and organization. We talked about how the farmers became kind of the redheaded stepsister, okay, which is not a gratuitous shot at redheads. My niece is a ginge. I love ginges, okay. It's just to say that the farmers become, the uncle that nobody wants to talk about. They become the downtrodden because the emphasis, now we want to integrate this together. Remember, what I'm trying to do is get you to see how all of the puzzle pieces fit together. The Republican Party is dominating the government with a few episodes where the Democrats come in. Well, the Republican Party favors big industry and the development and growth of industry. This is why they introduced the protectionist trade barriers. Okay? Well, as a result of that, the farmers are going to become the downtrodden. Okay? Also, it's a reaction to business concentration, because with business concentration, as we talked about in the presentation on industrial organization and development, the problem with this concentration, and it actually was a question in Quiz 1, the problem with this development is that it allows for price fixing, which is to say, set artificially high prices that are beyond the market price. And it's not just the agricultural sector that's going to suffer from this. Everyone suffers from this. Okay? And so you see everything there, although that shouldn't say... All right. So typos are typos, right? There was not, in fact, yes, the great baking crisis of 1893 when they ran out of yeast and bread. Now, I know what's going to happen. Somebody on the quiz is going to now spout off on the great baking crisis of 1893, where they ran out of yeast and bread, and all they could make was unleavened bread. That's not what that means. That means banking crisis. I just forgot to put an N in there. Okay. Kind of funny though, really, when you think about it. A baking crisis. What actually would constitute a baking crisis? What must a baking crisis be like? Okay. Political conditions, you see, as we've been talking about throughout this presentation, you have corruption, the party machines, nepotism, congressional gridlock, the ineffective presidency. All this is going to give rise to progressivism, which is then going to be crystallized in the populist. Now, as a reaction to the rise of this progressivism in the 1880s, you're going to have the first real attempt at government regulation of corruption. That's the Pendleton Civil Service Act. And the reason it's going to be introduced is that James Garfield is assassinated in 1881. He is assassinated by a disgruntled office seeker. Okay, someone wanted a civil service job, didn't get that civil service job, and in their despondency, murdered Garfield. Okay, so as a result of that, they changed the system, and this is the way the system now works. Although by some of the government employees I've had to deal with recently with the flood insurance thing with FEMA, you couldn't prove it by me. But they now, when you go for a government job, you have to take a civil service exam. That places you and determines your aptitude for the job. This replaces this position of nepotism. What it used to be was that people got jobs in the government. This is actually ever since Andrew Jackson. It actually even predates. Andrew Jackson gets blamed for this somewhat unfairly. It actually predates Jackson by a little bit. But basically, you get civil service jobs and the paycheck therewith in exchange for political favoritism. Okay? So if you support a particular candidate, a particular president, right, they'll give you a job and a salary. to pay you off, so to speak. Well, as a result of this is what creates this system of nepotism. And it's really Andrew Jackson. It wasn't, as I said, it wasn't Andrew Jackson that really started this. It goes back all the way back to the beginnings. But Jackson made it absolute. It just mushroomed under Jackson. Okay, it became the standard policy. Was this nepotism, and it will dominate all the way through the 19th century until the Pendleton Civil Service Act. And then the Pendleton Civil Service Act will correct for it to some degree, but even to this day, it's not a perfect system, particularly at the local political level. At the national political level, it's a little bit better that they have to have aptitude or skill at their job. In the 1890s is also the adoption of the Australian ballot, and this will really reduce and actually ultimately kind of destroy the fabric of the party machine. What the Australian ballot refers to, you see there on the PowerPoint, is a secret ballot. Until the 1890s, voting ballots were not secret. Okay, they were public knowledge, and so it gave the party machine considerable control over their constituency because they would know how the constituency voted. And so literally what would happen in the late 19th century is you would buy votes, okay? Then you could tell whether or not they had fulfilled, the voter had fulfilled their end of the agreement. The Australian ballot's going to replace all of that. And that's, I always have to say that because really when all was said and done, my mom was a bigwig in local politics down in the Baldwin Whitehall School District for years and years. And as a result of that, she has a certain party machine mentality. And every election, she asks me the same question. She says, who did you vote for? And I always, every election, give her the same response, which I took off a very popular, a very excellent HBO series known as The Wire. I say to her, the sanctity of the voting booth is the cornerstone of the American democracy. And so I don't tell her. It's none of her business. It's none of anybody's business who I voted for. When you go to the polls nowadays, you'll know they can tell what party you're affiliated with and whether or not you've cast a ballot in that election. But they do not know how you have voted. Well, it's the 1890s that starts this. We also have a wave of initiatives and referendums. The difference between these two things, and just kind of, again, this is stuff that you should have covered in American government, or you should have just as general knowledge from high school, if from nothing else. Initiatives and referendums are popular votes. When you put something on a referendum or introduce an initiative, it goes to a popular vote. Okay, so the next time there's a ballot where you're electing candidates for office, you're also electing referendums and initiatives. Okay, the difference is an initiative is introduced by petition from the people. Okay, so it's from the bottom up. Initiatives are more grassroots. Okay, referendums are introduced by the government. If the government can't make a decision on something, they'll introduce a referendum and let the people decide. Okay, whereas initiatives are different. Initiatives are introduced from a popular movement. Okay, what you do is you run around with a petition for a particular issue to go on a ballot, and that's an initiative. Now, economic reform begins at this. This is the beginning of government regulation of the marketplace. We're going to have two biggies. The Interstate Commerce Commission, formed in 1887, and the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. They work as antecedents to each other. They work in conjunction with each other. And it's important to point this out. Theodore Roosevelt, now this will be in an epoch too, but Theodore Roosevelt will use these two to break up the large trusts. For example, Standard Oil will be broken up as a result of this, okay? But when they originally introduced them in the late 1880s, it's not business that is the target. And I mentioned this before during the discussion of organized labor. The Sherman Antitrust Act and the Interstate Commerce Commission are largely intended to break unionization. Okay? And the thinking is simple. We talked at some length in the discussion of industrial development and organization. We talked about horizontal mergers. And this was on quiz 1. A horizontal merger is a merger in which two producers of the same product unify. Okay, they conglomerate together. Well, labor unions therefore represent a horizontal merger. And so in an attempt to stop this, they're going to truncate, they're going to try to limit the amount of horizontal mergers that can take place. It will later be available to Theodore Roosevelt, to use against the big trust companies. Okay? And actually, as it works out, it's never used against a labor union. Okay? They never actually do pull the trigger on that against a labor union. Interstate Commerce Commission is kind of the same thing. The Interstate Commerce Act regulates interstate trade based on the Constitution. That's one of the national government's powers under the Constitution, is to regulate interstate trade. Well, a national union should therefore come under regulation of the government under the Interstate Commerce Commission, because labor is a commodity like anything else. And so when you have a labor union that exists in multiple states, that represents interstate commerce. It's kind of a gray area. It's never been used for that. But this is the beginning of it in this period. And again, it's a reaction, or I guess I would say a co-optation or incorporation of the rise of this progressivism, this populism that's coming up. Now, more specifically to the Populist Party itself. As I mentioned before, all of these splinter parties, all of these single-issue parties, these lobbying groups, so to speak, coalesce together into the Populist Party, and it creates what's known as the AMLA platform. And you can go through the PowerPoint on that. We'll just read it over together real quickly. Rejection of laissez-faire economics, meaning they favor government intervention in the marketplace, regulation of the marketplace, okay? They favor government ownership of public utilities and railroads. This is one of the elements that borders on, that is the explanation for why they're referred to, or at least some of their elements are referred to as socialists. Okay, because you're talking about state ownership of a means of production, in this case, public utilities and railroads. They're talking about a national currency controlled by government. Now, the United States had a national currency, the dollar, but it was not controlled by the government. Okay, you had an independent banking system that was not subject to government regulation. Nowadays, you have kind of a hybrid between that. This is something that a lot of people don't understand, and I think we'll probably end up discussing it at some length in Epoch 2, maybe even in Epoch 3, is the Federal Reserve System. And it's important to point out, students often misunderstand this. The Federal Reserve System is not controlled by the national government. The only control the national government has over it is regulatory in terms of statutory law on the banking industry. And the president gets to appoint the head of the Federal Reserve Board. Other than that, the Federal Reserve is a private organization currently run by Janet Yellen, the first woman in history to run the Federal Reserve. Continuing with the Omaha platform, we have the expansion of the money supply. This represents the greenback movement, also very popular with the Grangers. The idea is increase the supply of paper money. We talked at some length in previous PowerPoints about the difficulty with this. If you end up with a run on it, if everyone comes in to cash in their cash currency for gold and silver all at the same time, there won't be enough gold and silver. We'll deal with that again when we get to the Great Depression, because that's really what causes a lot of the banking crisis in the 1930s. It will cause a lot of the banking crisis in the 1890s as well. They favor a graduated income tax where the rich pay more than the poor. That won't actually come into being until just prior to the First World War. Redistribution of large land holdings. Again, this is another socialist element. Popular election of senators. Now, this will finally come to pass in the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. At this point in history, the U.S. Senate is not elected by the people. The U.S. Senate is elected by state governments. Okay? More similar to the Bundesrat than the Bundestag, if you're familiar at all with German politics. And there's absolutely no reason you should be familiar with German politics. I should put that on this week's quiz. I should put that as a question about the Bundestag and the Bundesrat. I won't. This is U.S. history. This is in German history or German politics. Okay, fine. But at any rate, enough said. And then finally, a secret ballot to reduce the corruption and power of party machines, which, as we see, that actually will come to pass as a result of the Omaha platform. That'll be one of the first things that's co-opted and brought into the mainstream of politics. They also there is an expansion throughout this period of government power. Okay, we see civil service reform. This is a reaction to the rising tide of progressivism. Trade policy, which we've talked about before, will continue unabated. Okay, we will still have a dominance of the protectionist trade regime, principally to raise government money, which they'll need until the income tax is first implemented, and to protect the growth of American manufacturing industry against foreign competition. And we see this is the post-Civil War trade regime. You can see that there are tariffs on over 4,000 items. Here's an interesting little tidbit for you, just because it's going through my mind. We'll talk about it a little bit more when we get to Epoch 3. The United States, after the Second World War, introduced at the Bretton Woods summit meeting the idea of a free trading regime where we sponsor and support, okay, where the United States sponsors and supports a limitation or an elimination of trade barriers, okay. Despite that, the United States has the greatest number of trade restrictions on the planet, okay. They have trade restrictions on over 2,500 commodities, and so it seems kind of contradictory to be the champion of free trade and have the most trade restrictions on the planet. But that's, again, now I'm off on a tangent, right? Okay. Republicans are pro-tariff, Democrats. The McKinley Tariff Act of 1890 will be an example of the severity of tariffs. It puts tariffs of upwards of 40 and 50% on some items. And so, in a sense, we talked about this before, that the United States, there was a myth that the United States was isolationistic in the 19th century and didn't really become involved in world politics until the First World War, and then they entered back in during the interwar years from 1918 till 1939 back into an isolationism. That's not entirely true. We saw that they did actually have an active foreign policy. We'll see it again in the development of the empire. But in terms of trade, there was a certain isolationism that went on. It was almost an autarky is where you don't trade with anybody. An autarkic movement. We talked about these two before, and the Supreme Court's intervention here. We'll look at them in court decisions. In 1977, you have the famous court case of Munn versus Illinois, and you see what it did. It decided that state governments could regulate private property when it was devoted to public use. This is an example of government intervention into the private sector. In 1886, that long court case, Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific Railway Company versus Illinois, this will reverse Munn versus Illinois, and it's important to see why it reverses it. It doesn't reverse it on the grounds that, no. The government can intervene in the private sector like that. Instead, it intervenes and says, well, no. The railroad industry is an interstate industry, and therefore it's not subject to the regulation of the states. The only one that can regulate it is the national government. Okay? Sometimes incorrectly referred to. You hear me say this all the time. Sometimes incorrectly referred to as the federal government. I never. Unless I'm just not thinking at all, I never refer to it as the federal government. Federal is a system of government, not a level of government. It's the national level. A federal system of government is a system of government that separates sovereignty, that divides sovereignty between the national level and regional jurisdictions. In the United States, there are basically three levels of government that divide sovereign authority: the national level, the state level, and the local level. And now, finally, this is going to be the final lecture, lecture number 7, is going to be more extensively on monetary policy. We've talked about this at some length, and we'll finish up in the next lecture on it. But you have an ongoing debate, and we've now seen it. It's a rising tide, okay? Those who favor a tight monetary policy with limited credit, limited circulation of paper money, okay? This is favored by the creditors. This is favored by the Republican Party. The Democratic Party at this time and the Greenback movement and ultimately the Populist Party favors a looser monetary policy, okay, principally so that the debtors can get more money to repay their debt. Now, the fact that when you circulate more money, that money loses its value, it means that when they repay the creditors are getting less real value back than they lent out. Okay, so you have this raging debate. You'll have a debate over the bimetallic system and whether or not silver and gold should be abandoned, should we use fiat money. They won't do that. They won't abandon the system until 1933 under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then finally, you have an expansion of the silver supply. The problem with this, and again, we'll deal with it at greater length in the discussion of monetary conditions themselves in the next PowerPoint. But the problem with this is, if you expand the silver supply, that expands the amount of specie. Greater supply means less valuable. Okay? And again, the example that I used before is a good one. If you have 1 ounce of silver and $1 in currency, that ounce of silver is worth $1 of paper currency. But if you increase the supply of silver and keep the supply of paper currency steady at $1, and you double the supply of silver to $2, now that $1 is worth $2 in silver. Silver loses its value. The dollar becomes overvalued. Okay? And we'll see what that means in the next lecture a little bit. The Sir Sherman Silver Purchase Act, you see in 1890, ongoing economic conditions led to further expansion of money supply through purchase of silver with T-notes. Okay, so they're trying to expand the money supply in 1890s. By the time they bring that online, though, it's like too little, too late. The panic in 1892 is really at that point kind of unavoidable. But I think that really we'll deal with that at greater length in the next presentation. That I think concludes, if I'm not mistaken, PowerPoint 1.6.